All right, we're working our way through the Bible, and we've spent a lot of time in the Old Testament, but now we're turning our attention to the New. And one of the reasons, of course, that we spend so much time in the Old Testament is because if we're going to understand the New, we have to understand the Old. And many people don't really have a good grasp of the Old Testament, and so it's hard for them to understand the New Testament. But because we've spent so much time in the Old Testament, now we need to fast forward a little as we work our way through the New Testament. And so we're looking at the Gospels, but actually we're only going to look at one Gospel, and that is the Gospel of Mark. And that's not because the other Gospels are not important. Obviously they are, and not because it wouldn't be worthwhile to spend a lot of time in each one of those Gospels, but just because we don't have a lot of time. And so we're looking at Mark, and we've talked about the author, and we've talked about the background, the purpose, and we've even mentioned some of the themes. Now we're going to look at what makes Mark distinctive, what are some of the things that sets Mark apart, and then just work our way through the book as quickly as we can. But Mark has a number of things that's actually in common with a couple of the other Gospels. With all the Gospels, they're all about Jesus, of course. That Mark has a lot in common with Matthew and Luke. They call these three Gospels the Synoptic Gospels because they all talk about Jesus in a certain way. John wrote his Gospel later, and John had these Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and so he didn't need to write what they wrote, of course, about Jesus. And in a sense, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are looking at Jesus from the ground up. They're kind of looking at him as man, explaining that he was more than man, of course, he was God, but they're looking at him from a human perspective, and John is very theological, so you might say John is giving us a divine perspective. They all give us a divine perspective on Jesus, so I don't want you to get confused, but John is a very theological gospel. Mark is a very action-packed gospel. What makes Mark unique, even among the synoptics? It has a lot in common with Matthew and Luke, but there are some things that are definitely different. Like, for example, Mark is the shortest gospel, but when it tells a story, it includes the most details. It's kind of ironic. One man writes, Mark includes more personal details about Jesus than any other gospel. For example, Mark is the only writer to mention that Jesus was a carpenter during his early adulthood. Mark shows Jesus' full humanity as well as his deity. Jesus got tired and hungry, just as every person does. He experienced a great heaviness of heart and sorrow as he prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane the night before his crucifixion. Mark notes Jesus' anger and sorrow at the hardness of people's hearts in the synagogue and how he rebuked his disciples for turning little children away. Jesus was also compassionate towards a leprous man and towards a huge crowd that were like, or who were like, a sheep without a shepherd. So Mark has a lot of details about Jesus. He wants you to know Jesus as the man. But even with all those details, he doesn't get lost in the story. He is very action-packed. He focuses on Jesus' works more than his words. He talks about Jesus as a teacher all the time, actually, but he doesn't give us as much of his teaching as, for example, Matthew. 60% of Matthew's words are Jesus' words. 51% of Luke's, but for Mark, it's under 42%. Mark's emphasis is on Jesus' mighty works. And as he writes, another distinctive of Mark is that he gets right into the story. It almost feels like Mark is kind of in a hurry. He's in a rush. You see, there's no birth narrative. And actually, another distinctive of Mark is that there's no conclusion, no real conclusion. If you look at the end, actually, of Mark, there's a question, so I need to sort of explain what I just said. If you look at Mark chapter 16, you have to decide. If you look at what comes after verse 8, it says, some of the earliest manuscripts do not include verses 9 through 20. And I think that this longer ending was probably added. One of the things we have when it comes to the Gospels are a lot of copies from a lot of different eras, going all the way back. I mean, really close to the time of Mark. And because we have all these copies, we can compare the copies and we can see what's here, what's there. And because we have all these copies, we know what parts might have we might have questions about because they come later on and they're not in the earliest manuscripts. And this is one of those. Verses 9 through 20 is missing from various old and the most reliable manuscripts. The early church fathers, they don't quote these verses. There were church leaders named Eusebius and Jerome, and they, in their time, state that this section is missing in most of the manuscripts. And this section contains words and expressions that you don't find in the rest of the Gospel of Mark. So it's probably added. There's good reason to think that Mark didn't write verses 9 through 20. But part of the reason it may have been added is because if you look at Mark without it, it almost seems like he doesn't have a conclusion. He talks about the resurrection of Jesus and the ladies seeing Jesus risen, and he ends verse 8, Mark 16, verse 8, and they went out and fled from the tomb, for trembling and astonishment had seized them, and they said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And so this is kind of a question as you study the Gospel of Mark. You have to decide, did they lose the ending? Is that why it ends at verse 8 like that, with these ladies just being afraid? Did Mark die before he finished the Gospel, these last few words? Or is this ending deliberate? And I think it's obviously deliberate. Really, he's presented Jesus to us. He's talked about what it means to be a disciple. And he's shown us the risen Jesus. And it's almost like here, he's leaving us hanging with a question. How is the early church going to respond? How are we going to respond to who Jesus is and what Jesus has done? So Mark is the shortest gospel. There's lots of action in Mark. There's not much of a conclusion, or at least an unusual conclusion. It's not chronological, really. We get hung up on this because of the, modern sensibilities or something. But ancient historians didn't always write in chronological order. And, even as we write, we're just more familiar with the genre now and the way people write now. But even as people write histories now, they sometimes jump back and forth in a person's life. And ancient historians did that, and they did it because they were also preachers. They were rhetoricians, you might say. They were people who were trying to persuade by talking about what had happened. And so sometimes they would group stories together in order to make a certain point. And Mark definitely does that. For example, he puts parables together in Mark 4, 1 to 33. Parables all having to do with a certain theme. He groups miracles together in Mark 4:35 through 5:43. In chapter 2, verse 1 through 3:6, this might be actually one of the most obvious examples. Mark has, in chapter 1, talked about how popular Jesus is. In chapter 2, verse 1 through 3:6, he tells a set of stories where religious leaders are asking questions of Jesus, and really each of those questions reveals the problems they had with Jesus. So at the end of chapter 1, you're kind of looking at Jesus as being so popular and asking, how did he die? Chapter 2, Mark says, this is what made the religious leaders so angry with Jesus. And this is important because it means as you're reading the Gospel of Mark, you often have to look at the story, but not just at the story, but also the story that goes before it and goes after it. For example, if you look at Mark chapter 12, verses 41 through 44, you read this story about this widow, and she gives her last penny, 2 small copper coins, and Jesus says, truly, truly, I say to you, this poor widow has put in more than all those who are contributing to the offering box. And you see this widow in this passage, and you are tempted to think, oh, what a widow. And in a sense, that's not wrong. It is amazing what she did. But when you look at what goes before this story and what goes after, you start to see it from a different perspective. Verses 38 through 41. And in his teaching, he said, "Beware of the scribes who like to walk around in long robes and like greetings in the marketplace and have the best seats in the synagogue and the places of honor at feasts, who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive greater condemnation." So before he talks about a widow, he talks about religious leaders who are taking advantage of widows. And then right after he talks about the widow, chapter 13, verses 1 and 2, he talks about the destruction of the temple. And so that makes you look at the story of the widow a little bit differently. Certainly she is an example, but maybe she's not just an example of faith, she's also an example of what was wrong with the religion in Jesus' day. You had these religious leaders who tried to look all righteous and good, but really were incredibly greedy and were taking advantage of the vulnerable for their own benefit. And that's why the temple was, one of the reasons why the temple was going to be destroyed. Another thing Mark likes to do is sandwich stories. So he'll start a story, and then he'll go on to another story, and then he'll come back to the story he started. So almost like a person who rambles, not like that at all, but almost like a person who rambles, where he starts to tell a story, starts to tell another story, and then he's like, oh yeah, let me tell you about this first story. Let me finish that up. But Mark does it for a purpose. It's also deliberate. That's how he's different than a person who rambles, because what's in the middle is often the key to understanding everything that you're reading. There's a connection between the stories, and if you're going to understand, you have to understand what that connection is. For example, you have Mark 11, verses 12 through 25. And in verses 12 through 14, you read this strange story about Jesus coming from Bethany and being hungry, and he sees this fig tree, and he goes up to the fig tree to see if he could find anything on it. He comes to it. There is just nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he says to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And that sounds kind of strange of Jesus, right? He gets so upset at a fig tree that's not bearing fruit that he judges it. And you wonder what's going on. But then you read verses 15 through 19, and you see Jesus entering the temple and driving out those who sell and those who bought in the temple, and really talking about how they had turned the temple that was meant to be a place of prayer for all nations into a place where they could extort money from all nations. And then he comes back in verses 20 to 25 to talking about the fig tree. And then he says in verses 23 through 25, "Have faith in God. Truly I say to you, whoever says to this mountain, be taken up and thrown into the sea, and does not doubt in his heart, but believes that what he says will come to pass, it will be done for him. Therefore I tell you, whatever you ask in prayer, believe that you've received it, and it will be yours. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who's in heaven may forgive you your trespasses." So, okay, that's a strange set of stories. Jesus comes on this fig tree, and he curses it because it doesn't have fruit. Then he goes into the temple, and it's all about how they have ruined the temple, the religious leadership. They have used the temple for something that God never intended the temple to be used for. Then he comes back to the fig tree, and they see that it is judged, just the way Jesus said it would be judged. And then he talks about this mountain, and what was up on a mountain. Where had Jesus just come from? The Temple Mount. The temple was up on a mountain. And so what is going on here when Jesus talks about faith and all of that? Jesus is saying to his disciples, look, this fig tree, how I judged this fig tree because it didn't bear fruit. It's not like rocket science to figure this out. I said this fig tree that's not bearing fruit is going to be judged. We've come back, and what happened? It's judged. We just went into the temple. What did we see while we were in the temple? It's not bearing fruit. It's not at all bearing the kind of fruit that God wanted the temple to bear. The Jews, the religious leadership who was there, they were not bearing the fruit that God wanted them to bear. So what do you think is going to happen? Well, what's going to happen to that temple is exactly what Jesus said was going to happen to that temple. It's going to be thrown into the sea, in a sense. It's going to be completely judged, destroyed. And the destruction of the temple, of course, is an example of how God does exactly what he says he's going to do and does the impossible in salvation, but he also does the impossible in judgment. It might look impossible for God to judge the temple, but he did. And he kept his word to Jesus. So one of the ways you understand what Mark is doing, one of the things that's distinctive about Mark, or at least a little distinctive, there are many other writers that use it, but Mark uses this technique a lot, the sandwich technique. Another thing that Mark does is he'll repeat a similar story at the beginning and end of a unit. So as you work your way through Mark, they didn't have chapters back then, but there's a sense in which he groups stories together almost in a chapter. And one way you know you've begun and ended a chapter in Mark is that there's a similar story at the beginning and at the end. So like chapter 8, verses 22 through 24, you find another one of Mark's strange stories where Mark 8, 22 through 24, they come to Bethsaida. Some people bring to him a blind man, beg him to touch him. He takes the blind man by the hand and leads him out of the village. And when he had spit on his eyes and laid his hands on him, he asked, "Do you see anything?" And he looked up and said, "I see people, but they look like trees walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he opened his eyes. His sight was restored. Then he saw everything clearly, and he sent him to his home, saying, "Do not even enter the village." And you read that story. It's a healing story, but it's strange. Was he just not able to heal this guy in the first try? Of course, that's not what's going on. But you wonder what's going on. And then after reading this story, what comes next? You get all these passion predictions. So you have the disciples, and they understand Jesus to a certain extent, but it's clear as Jesus describes what he's going to do that they don't fully get it. Jesus says, they know he's the Messiah, but they don't understand how he's going to accomplish the work of the Messiah because Jesus is going to be crucified. And so they see, but they don't quite see. And then Mark closes up this particular section with Mark chapter 10, verses 46 through 52, where they come to Jericho. There's this Bartimaeus who also is blind, just like the guy at the beginning. And when he hears that it was Jesus of Nazareth, he begins to cry out, "Jesus, Son of David, have mercy on me." He knows who Jesus is. "Son of David, have mercy on me." And then he asks, "What do you want me to do for you?" Jesus asks him, calls him to himself and asks him, "What do you want me to do for you?" And he says, "I want to be able to see." And Jesus says, "Go your way. Your faith has made you well." And so what's happening here? He introduces this section with this blind man who partially sees as a result of his relationship with Jesus, and then comes to fully see. And then we read about the disciples and Jesus, and we see they partially see, but they don't fully see. And yet we have hope as we look at blind Bartimaeus that they will come to see. They will really come to understand that Jesus is the Son of David. This blind Bartimaeus is the only one who really sees that now. He understands Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament prophecies, and the disciples will come to see that. They'll come to understand that fully. They'll be able to see clearly, and it's going to happen as a result of faith. It's going to come as a result of faith. There's also a great deal of paradox in Mark. Mark is a writer who likes to turn things on their head, or at least point out when Jesus turns things on their head. So Mark 4:31 and 32, he talks about the kingdom of God being like a grain of mustard seed, which is so small, but then becomes larger than everything else. Chapter 8, verse 35, he talks about whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. Chapter 9, verse 35, if you want to be first, you must be last. You must be a servant of all. Chapter 10, verse 30, he talks about how you're going to receive 100-fold now in this time's houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands with persecutions. And in the age to come, eternal life. Again, verse 31, Many who are first will be last, and the last first. He's pointing out all these surprising things about how life works and how following Jesus works, which of course would be good for those who are being persecuted, right? Because they can see some things so clearly, and yet other things are confusing, and that's kind of the mystery of the Christian life right now. Mark is pointing out that Jesus made this clear. Mark 10, 43 and 44. Whoever should be great among you must be your servant. Whoever would be first among you must be slave of all. And we could really go on and on. This is a gospel that is saying things are not always the way they seem. Things are not always the way they seem. The slave is the greatest. The first are last. You're persecuted, but you're going to receive eternal life. One of the things I like best about Mark, though, is that it reads almost like a movie. And it's almost as if Mark is carrying around a video camera showing us Jesus. And I think that helps us understand its structure. If you look at chapter 1, verses 1 through 15, it's like Mark sets the scene, like any good director of a film would, I suppose. And he introduces the main characters. You have Mark, the writer, you have John the Baptist, you have God, you have Satan, and you have Jesus himself. And then you have, after he sets the scene, Act 1, which is chapter 1, verse 16 through chapter 8, verse 21. And this is filmed mostly in Galilee and the northern regions. And the primary question he's answering, or at least getting us to think about in these chapters, is who is Jesus? And so he shows us Jesus as king, bringing in the kingdom, this miracle worker with all sorts of success in chapter 1, and yet there's some questions about him. What kind of man is this? Who is able to perform these kinds of miracles? Then, after showing Jesus performing astounding miracles in chapter and receiving all kinds of acclaim as a result, in chapter 2, verses 1 through 3, verse 6, you find him opposed by the religious leaders. They don't want his kingdom, and Mark helps you understand why. They don't want to submit to his authority. And he shows you, as they get upset with Jesus, a little more about who Jesus is. What made Jesus more than just a miracle worker was the fact that he claimed to be able to forgive sins. He spent time with sinners. He said he was coming to save sinners, actually. He wasn't mourning. He was and looking forward to the Messiah's coming because he was the Messiah. He was the Lord of the Sabbath. And because of the way the religious leaders had twisted religion, chapter 3, verse 6, they become angry with Jesus as a result of all these claims he was making and seek to kill him. So at the end of chapter 1, the crowds are just pursuing Jesus. At the end of chapter 3, the religious leaders are wanting to kill Jesus. Chapter 3, verses 7 through 31, he's shown us Jesus, and now he's asking or demanding that we respond to Jesus, and basically saying it's not enough to be his family. It's not even enough even to be a religious leader. You need to confess Jesus for who he is and demonstrate that you believe Jesus is who he is by doing what he says. In chapter 4, verses 1 through 31, he shows us Jesus as a king who is coming with a kingdom, but he warns us you have to listen really carefully to Jesus if you're going to understand how he's bringing in this kingdom. And then 4, verse 35 through 6:6, there are all these miracles which demonstrate the importance of faith for experiencing the salvation Jesus brings. For example, you remember the disciples on the boat in the middle of the storm being so scared. Jesus says, "Why are you so afraid? Have you no faith?" And then they say they really are afraid because they see Jesus calm the storm, and they say, "Who is this?" He overcomes demons in chapter 5, and he sends this man out really as a missionary. And then in chapter 6, verses 1 through 6, you see Jesus not being able to do any mighty work in a certain place. And why? He goes away marveling because of their unbelief. Chapter 6, verse 7 through 8:21 Mark shows us this stunning blindness of people to who Jesus was. Herod, he thinks Jesus is John, the one he beheaded. Jesus feeds the 5,000, and it's like God providing manna for the Israelites in the wilderness. He's the second Moses, but the disciples are still not getting this. Chapter 6, verses 35 and 36. He walks on water, and the disciples are saying, "What? Wait, is this a ghost?" He keeps showing that he's king, and yet people are not seeing it. They're not really understanding what kind of king he came to be. And so the Pharisees come and attack Jesus, and Jesus reveals what's at the heart of their problem. It wasn't a problem with Jesus, it was a problem with them. You have all these people in these chapters who should have been seeing Jesus, but who were missing him. And so then Jesus goes outside of Israel, and there's a Gentile woman who gets it, and Jesus is amazed by her faith. And ultimately, this whole section where Mark is showing us Jesus and showing us what's needed to see Jesus, faith, and showing us people who are missing Jesus, ends with a question in Mark 8, verse 21. Mark 8, verse 21. Jesus here has fed the 4,000. He's told the disciples, watch out for the leaven of the Pharisees and the leaven of Herod. Don't get me wrong, in other words, because of hypocrisy. And they're talking about, wait, what does he mean? And Jesus asked them at the end of this section, verse 21, do you not yet understand? And that's really the question of the first section of Mark. He introduces Jesus, he shows us Jesus, and he is ending this first chapter by saying, after all this, do you not really understand who Jesus is? So that's Act 1. Act 2 of this movie is chapter 8, verse 22 through 10. And Jesus is now on the way to Jerusalem, and the key question this section answers is, what did Jesus come to do? And really what Mark shows us here is that the key to understanding Jesus and what it means to be a Christian revolves around the cross. And so he's revealing the fact that Jesus was going to die and what that death meant for Jesus and what that death meant for those who follow. And you remember he begins with a story that was almost like a parable with the blind man who kind of saw but didn't fully see. That's just like the disciples. Peter confesses, Jesus, you're the Messiah, but the first time Jesus starts talking about the cross, Peter tries to rebuke him. And so what's the issue? They get who Jesus is now, but they don't get how Jesus is going to accomplish the mission God had given him. And Jesus then applies this principle to the disciples themselves and says, what I'm doing, you must do. This is the basic pattern for how God is working in this world. Suffering, then glory. And then he gives them a preview of the kingdom. So there's going to be glory. This is chapter 9, verses 2 through 8. And this is the transfiguration. Jesus has said, okay, if you're going to understand me and what it means to be a follower, you have to understand the cross. But the cross doesn't mean, all the suffering doesn't mean there isn't glory. Glory's coming. And let me give you a little picture of what that glory is going to be like. And that's the transfiguration. Heaven comes down to earth. And there's a real contrast here at the transfiguration with what happens later at the cross. And that's to encourage us. The future glory that the Bible promises is not contradicted by what happened at the cross. Instead, the cross is a key part of how God's going to bring that glory about. There are stages, you might say, in how God's accomplishing his plan. And so the transfiguration is a peak of that future stage. And what do you see at the transfiguration? What do you see at the cross? You see light at the transfiguration, darkness at the cross. You see his clothes shining at the transfiguration, his clothes stripped off at the cross. You see two saints at the transfiguration, two criminals at the cross. You see Elijah at the transfiguration people mocking Jesus because they think he's talking to Elijah. You see disciples present at the transfiguration, disciples fleeing at the cross. You see God speaking at the transfiguration, God silent at the cross. And of course, it's the same Jesus. It's the same Jesus, but God has a plan, and he wants to help the disciples understand that plan involves suffering and then glory. And the disciples are confused as they come down the mountain, and Jesus once again has to emphasize to them in chapter 9, verses 11 through 13, that things are going exactly according to plan. The problem with the disciples, why they weren't getting it, rest of the chapter, is actually a lack of faith. You remember how the disciples couldn't cast out that one demon. Why does that come after the disciples asking these questions about how God was going to accomplish his plan? It reveals the fundamental problem with the disciples right now. They weren't trusting what God had to say. And Jesus gives us an example of what we should be doing when we're confused about what God is doing in this world. We should believe what he said, and we should pray. There's another prediction about the crucifixion in verses 30 to 32 of chapter 9, and then there's more confusion from the disciples, and they're worried. Instead of being worried about Jesus, they're worried about which one of them is the greatest. And Jesus basically here is trying to turn their whole world upside down. They've been thinking God was going to accomplish his plan one way. God is going to accomplish that plan, but in a way that's different than they were anticipating. And so in the rest of chapter 9, he gives them some insight how they are to live as they're waiting for the kingdom to come in glory. And they need wisdom. You could read chapter 9, verses 38 through 41, because they're going to come under attack. Then in chapter 10, he begins to teach them about how to follow him in this age that's going to be characterized by suffering. And basically he says they need to be like a child. They need to trust him like a child trusts his father. They need to watch out for greed, because greed and a desire for comfort now is going to lead them off track. And then he encourages the disciples that death is not the end. You remember he heals that child that everyone thought was dead. And in chapter 10, verses 23 and following, he also encourages them that just because they're going to suffer now doesn't mean that they're not going to experience glory in the future. And then after all of this instruction, he tells them about his death a third time. So chapter 8 through chapter 10 is all about what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah and the difference it makes on discipleship. And he keeps coming back to the cross, and the disciples keep not getting it. James and John in chapter 10, verses 35 through 45, respond to this third announcement about the cross by asking Jesus which one of them was going to be the greatest. And again, what is Jesus doing here? When they think about Messiah, they're thinking one thing. They're thinking glory now. And Jesus is saying, right now, actually, it's going to be different. He's not saying it's not going to happen, but it's not going to happen the way you think. You have to apply the cross to the way you think about your life right now. And what it means, Jesus says at the end of chapter 10, is that you should think about greatness as being a slave or being a servant. And we find a great explanation of Jesus's purpose in Mark 10, verse 45, where he says, "For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And then you get this confirmation that in spite of how it looks, Jesus really is who he says he is, from an unlikely source, that blind beggar Bartimaeus who cries out, "Jesus, you are the Son of David." And as a result, Jesus heals him, and it's kind of another true story that functions a little bit like a parable. This is how you're going to be able to see Jesus clearly. coming to him humbly like a beggar in faith, trusting that he is who the scripture says he is. And God, if you do that, God's going to open your eyes so that even now you can really see Jesus. So that helps you understand what comes next, which is Act 3 of Mark. You have Act 1, Jesus is a great king. A lot of people didn't get that because they lacked faith, but Jesus is a great king. Act 2, he's a king who's dying for a purpose, and that has implications for us as we seek to follow him. And Act 3, now we're ready, now that we know all that, we're ready to watch it happen. And so chapters 11 through 16, Jesus is in Jerusalem, and these chapters are all about how Jesus did it. Who Jesus is, what Jesus came to do, how Jesus did it. That's the Gospel of Mark. Chapter 11, verses 1 through 11, you have this connection with Zephaniah. Jesus is the promised king. Chapter 11, verses 12 through 25, you had judgment on the fig tree, and there's going to be judgment on the temple. Why? Because of all this wickedness. And so how should we respond? We should respond with faith, with prayer, with unity with God's people. Chapter 11, verses 26 through 33, the religious leaders attack. Chapter 12, verses 1 through 12, there's an explanation of what's happening and what the religious leaders' rejection means. Chapter 12, verses 13 through 17, because Jesus isn't going to be the kind of king right now that they thought he was going to be. How do they live in the meantime? Chapter 12, verses 18 through 27, the problem with the religious leaders. Chapter 12, verse 28 through 34, it's like Mark says, but that's not all religious leaders. Chapter 12, verse 35 through 37, an explanation of what it meant for Jesus to be the son of David. He is God. Chapter 12, verses 38 through 34, the problem with the religious leadership. Chapter 13, the result of the rejection of Jesus. The city and temple are going to fall in a generation. Disciples are going to be persecuted. There's encouragement here that the cross is not the end. Jesus is going to return. And the application is, right now, we've just got to work to stay awake. Chapter 14, people are wanting to kill Jesus. You also have sinners seeing who Jesus is. He's king. You have the Lord's Supper, the purpose of Jesus' death. You have the promise of the resurrection. You have the reminder that we need to pray in the face of persecution. You see Peter's failure and what's at the root of his failure. And then the disciples' fear. Jesus is taken to trial, and then we get this promise of future glory in Mark 14, 62 to 63. Chapter 15, Jesus is on display as King of the Jews, and we see that it is the centurion, this Roman Gentile, who sees Jesus for what he is, and we also see the surprising faith of Joseph of Arimathea, as he sees Jesus for who he is. Chapter 16, verses 1 through 8, you have the resurrection, and there's this great charge that Jesus gives his disciples in verse 6. He says, don't be afraid. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, or this is a great charge actually that the angel gave to the disciples, and the women in particular at the graveside. He said to them, do not be alarmed. You seek Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He's not here. See the place where they laid him. But go, tell his disciples and Peter that he is going before you to Galilee. So it ends here, verses 6 and 7, with the angel saying, stop being scared. This is exactly what he said. Jesus has risen from the dead. Now go out and be a witness. And verse 8 kind of feels like they didn't learn their lesson, because these women flee from the tomb. They're trembling, they're astonished. They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid. And that kind of leaves us thinking about our response. That's the whole point. That's why it ends the way it does. This is who Jesus is. He's the King. He's the Son of God. He's the fulfillment of Scripture. We need to have faith. We need to trust him. We need to follow him. And following him means that we're probably going to face suffering. We're not able to follow him, he says, unless we pick up our cross. And so as we begin to understand the implications of that, even as people living now, it causes us to ask a question. How are we going to respond? Our commission is not really our situation and our commission is not really very different than these original disciples. We know who Jesus is. we know, we understand now what he said about how he's going to accomplish God's mission. And actually, we're in a great position because we've seen that he's done it. He died, he rose again. We've seen the first stage in Jesus' exaltation. We know actually he ascended into heaven, and he sits now at the right hand of God. So we've seen it's suffering and then glory. And we've seen that he says this is the shape of the Christian life as well. And we know what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to go out and be witnesses of this Christ. And the question is, are we going to let fear keep us from living all out for Jesus? Or are we going to trust and believe that Jesus is with us, that Jesus is who he said he was, and he's doing what he said he would do, and he is with us even in the middle of all this persecution and suffering that we face as a result of following him? And will we pick up our cross, deny ourselves, pick up our cross, and stand up and stand out as bold witnesses of the risen Savior? That's Mark. That's Mark. How are you going to respond to it?